Hello there, welcome to the channel. This is Nerd.World. In today's episode, I'm continuing my series on Mirror Universe people, events, ships, whatever. In this one, I'm looking at the Mirror Universe version of Lieutenant Commander Tuvok, although of course he was not a Lieutenant Commander in the Mirror Universe. We see him once, canonically, in an episode of Deep Space Nine, and then after that a lot of the information is beta canon. But I've got together the most interesting bits. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below. Tuvok of the Mirror Universe was born in 2264 to a Vulcan that was already conquered by the Terran Empire. He would later be enlisted into Starfleet and would serve aboard the ISS Excelsior. Later, as the Empire began to reform into the Terran Republic, he would attend a meeting on Vulcan held in secret by Emperor Spock and the Empress Marlena and a few others to discuss changes to the Empire and basically the forming of a new order. This, of course, would be a sort of pseudo-federation or commonwealth that they intended on creating. But this also included the creation of the Memory Omega, which is somewhat akin to Memory Alpha of the Prime Universe. It would contain much of the knowledge of this new Terran Republic. The Terran Republic would fall, but the actual archive would be preserved, hidden on Vulcan, along with a set of plans derived by Spock, who had seen the end coming, which would result, hopefully, in the freedom of Vulcan and the other former Terran planets, including Earth, in about 100 years, basically foreshadowing the events which would give rise to the Terran Rebellion, which would ultimately give freedom to the worlds conquered by the Klingon-Cardassian alliance. Tuvok, being a Vulcan, was made a slave and eventually was owned by a Klingon officer named Takar. Takar was a relatively interesting officer who was a bit paranoid and fearful of technology. He was a bit of a technophobe and didn't really trust it. Tuvok was able to use this mistrust of technology to use technology to earn his own freedom by using it against Takar, who had a limited understanding of how technology could be used against him, as he was so fearful of it and allowed so little of it around. Tuvok would later become part of the Vulcan Resistance. Now this is when we see him later in the caves with the Terran rebels. The Terran Rebellion was in its infancy at this point, but was becoming more effective. Tuvok was the head of the Vulcan Resistance, and again he was protecting the Memory Omega information archive, which could, if used properly, be very useful to the Terran Rebellion, but also be greatly misused by them. So I think he was keeping that one close to his chest. But working with the Terran rebels was only logical. As a Vulcan, he was going to follow his logic. The Terrans were aggressive fighters, always had been, and even under the Alliance, the Terrans are still prospered as a warrior people. And now they were gaining their freedom, and as they began to fight and kill, it only made sense for the Vulcans to fight and kill alongside them, and Tuvok was beginning to get more involved with their rebellion and unite the two factions and probably other factions that were out there and other Alliance conquered worlds to defeat the Klingon-Cardassian alliance. Now, of course, from a Vulcan perspective, working with Terrans directly, especially on the concept of freedom, was a risk. Terrans were still an inherently very violent and aggressive people, and in one form or another had been made warrior peoples of the Alliance, and many Terran soldiers and likely some version of Starfleet existed which was completely in service to the Alliance. That wasn't to say that the Terrans didn't have the same goal. The problem was what the Terrans might do with their freedom at the end of it. The last time Terrans had their freedom, an invasion fleet made its way to Vulcan, and although my enemy's enemy might be my friend, that might not always be the way with the Terrans, as they had a habit of simply conquering everything that they encountered, and there was nothing to state that they might not go back to that. And the Terran Empire was just as bad, if not worse, than the Klingon-Cardassian alliance. The only difference was that it was the alliance currently in power, whereas there had been the Terrans in the past. And there was obviously a concern amongst Vulcans and other races that had lived under the yoke of Terran rule for so long that they might simply be replacing one master with another. So keeping the Terrans in sight and keeping an eye on what they were doing, as the Terrans were very anti-alien generally in the past, was only pragmatic, as Tuvok wanted to see Spock's dream of a sort of federation come to pass and not see the restoration of the Terran Empire and simply a return to the times when Terrans ruled and Vulcans and everyone else served the Empire. Later, during the war, as the conflict had grown, Tuvok would be aboard for a mission, the ship commanded by Captain Chakotay. This warship of some description, which is never really described as what kind of a vessel it was, but let's assume it was a Condor class, was captained by Captain Chakotay and had many other recognizable names aboard it. The vessel was called the Geronimo. They would encounter an alien and from across the galaxy named Neelix. Neelix and his partner had somehow ended up in the Alpha Quadrant for reasons I'm not going into, and his partner, Kes, who was powerfully telepathic, had been captured by the Alliance, and they were planning to exploit her for her abilities, to use her against the rebellion. Realizing how powerful her telepathic abilities were, as the Vulcans had been using their telepathic abilities for decades against Klingon and Cardassian officers to influence their decision-making, to undermine the Alliance, to create the set of circumstances where an effective rebellion such as the one now being undertaken by the Terrans could take shape and not be simply squatted out of existence by the vastly superior forces and fleet and resources that the Alliance had at its disposal. Captain Chakotay concurred that Kes would have to be saved, although it did take a little convincing. As a result, the Terrans would launch a rescue mission to liberate Kes, although Terrans would show their true colours a little later, as Tuvok would observe that their rescue of her was somewhat self-motivated. Yes, they wanted her rescued, but not for her own sake or for purposes of morality. It was to prevent the Alliance using her against them, but they would use her against the Alliance. They would also not inform Neelix that she had been rescued. Now, other than this, Tuvok would continue to be involved in the rebellion in one form or another. Of course, as the head of the Vulcan resistance, he was heavily involved more in their activities than those conducted by the Terrans, but would later be involved in the alliance that would form in the collapse of the Klingon-Cardassian alliance and the liberation of Vulcan, Earth, Andoria, and other planets, which would become a sort of pseudo-federation. There are, of course, other timelines, other universes, such as the Dark Universe, where he was actually a member of the crew of the ISS Discovery, I believe. Not Discovery, the ISS Titan, I believe. And a few other fan fictions and limited novels and comics where he pops up here and there. But I think these were the most interesting storylines which he had. One interesting side note is Chakotay really had bad luck in every universe of his crew, as their mission was almost completely decimated or completely undermined by a traitorous spy he had aboard his ship called Kate Janeway, who was actually a Terran spy for the Alliance and attempted to sabotage the mission of the Geronimo to rescue Kes and lead them all into a trap. Like I said, he has bad luck in both universes. Now, other than that, Tuvok was married in both universes and had 3 children in both universes. And again, beyond that, the two men were quite different, aside from some superficial similarities such as that. And there we have it, Tuvok of the Mirror Universe. Most of that is beta canon, to be honest. Most of the only bits in it that are predominantly canon are the fact that he was involved with the Terran Rebellion. Everything else is cropped up from comics and books and novellas around it. But there's still a lot of interesting storylines, and a lot of them are perfectly believable. Especially with the bits all dating back. You can imagine he probably would have been part of Starfleet aboard the Excelsior, as his Prime Universe counterpart was. The Vulcans were made slaves. It's easy to believe he was a slave, and the fact that he was a slave to Takar, a Klingon officer, was an in-joke amongst the people that wrote the story, as Takar was actually a Klingon officer who appeared, a Klingon mercenary who appeared in Star Trek, but was actually played by Tim Russ. So, slight little nod to itself there. That said, what did you think of his appearance? He's, to date, the only, incidentally, main character from another Star Trek series to appear in a Mirror Universe episode that wasn't within the canonical structure of its own show. In other words, he didn't just appear in a Mirror Universe episode in Voyager, he appeared in one in Deep Space Nine. And no one from any other series has done that. You didn't see Mirror Universe Riker appear in Voyager or something. It never happened. So, what do you think of him? What do you think of the story of Tuvok? Would you like me to do more of the beta canon stuff? Because to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of beta canon. I just thought his story needed a bit more fleshing out when I realised there wasn't really much canon to him. And I did find some of the beta canon stories of him rather interesting. That's it. Like, subscribe, share, comment down below, as it all helps the channel, and bye bye.